some folks and see some familiar faces. As you just indicated here, we're going to be recording the presentation today. For those who I may not have met, I am Steve Flynn. I'm the founding director of the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University, and really pleased to be moderating today's presentation by two of our stellar researchers at GRI and at Northeastern University, Kristen Raub and Joshua Loffer, who have been really spearheading a great job. They're going to share the fruits of the study that they have been doing around work of adapting, basically trying to figure out how tools that have been developed to help folks understand climate change, particularly related to water, can be better integrated into planning. One of the things we've certainly learned at GRI with the work that we've done with the communities is that a lot of things that both that are invented in the academy and also that are created by the federal government, or they're often the two are connected. The federal government will sponsor efforts to develop new tools. They really actually talk to the communities who have to use the tools, what they need and how the tools could be best calibrated to support those needs. It's usually, hey, this is a brilliant idea. I'm sure everybody will appreciate it, and sort of push it down. This is a challenge as we are dealing with clearly the growing impacts of climate and the associated hazards that generates, especially when it comes to things like extreme heat and with water, and either lots of it at once in a deluge, or water coming at you as a storm surge. All of these things are really forcing us to rethink, or should be forcing us to rethink, how we design our industrial landscape as well as our living landscape to cope. We're at a time, of course, of a historic investment by the federal government is poised to launch this $1.2 trillion in infrastructure investment. This is the time clearly that we should be ensuring that those investments are made in ways that are likely to endure throughout the life cycle of those investments. That is, over the decades that often we expect things to work. That means we have to forecast out what the likely environment is going to be where that is, and be able to adapt accordingly. And into this sort of crosshairs of that need and challenge is what Christian and Josh have been up to with an effort that was undertaking in Houston, Texas. I'm thrilled that one of our participants here is a distinguished senior fellow, Judge Ed Emmett, a former Harris County Commissioner, Harris County Judge who oversaw that. And I know this is an issue very near and dear to him. We've talked about it before. And so, Judge, I'll cue you up for hopefully thinking of good questions to pose or comments to provide after Christian and Josh have done their presentation. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to the two of you. And I know you have roughly about 15-20 minutes to kind of key this up, and then there's good time for those of us to ask questions and drill down further. So over to you, Christian and Josh.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and also thank you all for joining us today. We just have a few slides. Are those sharing okay? Okay.
Yeah, it looks good here.
So as Steve introduced, Josh and I are both from the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University, and then I'm also from Quasi. And our talk today is entitled Collaboration Between Tool Developers and Users, a Case Study Analysis of the National Water Model for Community Resilience Planning in Houston, Texas. So just a bit of an outline. First, we're going to go over our motivation for conducting this study, which is just a bit of a background on resilience planning and the National Water Model. Our methods, which were a set of interviews followed by a collaborative session, our results, which are primarily in the form of a set of recommendations, and then what we see as the key takeaways and next steps for this project. So the motivation, why did we decide to conduct this study? So first and foremost, we all know that water-related hazards threaten communities. Climate change is changing the way water moves around the planet, such as increasing the frequency and severity of flood events, which we also know are the costliest disaster in the US. Communities are then engaging in resilience planning to help them plan and adapt for these natural hazards, among many other things. However, we also know that resilience planning is a very resource and time and information intensive process. So many tools are being developed to aid communities in deciphering this information and also in this planning process. And these tools are also called climate services. So climate services can be defined as including the transformation of climate-related data together with other relevant information into customized products such as projections, forecasts, information, trends, economic analysis, assessments, including technology assessment, counseling on best practices, development and evaluation of solutions and other services in relation to climate that may be of use to society at large. And one of these climate services that is of particular interest to this study is Noaa's National Water Model. And this National Water Model is a new forecasting tool that will help forecasters predict when and where flooding can be expected. And as a bit of background information, the National Water Model is a hydrologic modeling framework that simulates observed and forecast stream flow over the entire continental United States. And this National Water Model simulates the water cycle with mathematical representations of the different processes and how they fit together. So essentially, it's able to tell us where water has been in the past, where it is currently, and where it is predicted to be in the future. Just as a caveat, Josh and I are not hydrologists, and we are not experts in the National Water Model. So if you do have particular questions or would like more information, we encourage you to visit this link we have provided below, or you can just Google National Water Model. It should be the first thing that pops up. Or you can reach out to Josh and I, and we'd be happy to connect you with our National Water Center collaborators who are experts in this topic. Okay, so just to recap, floods are threatening communities. Communities are then engaging in planning to help them prepare for these flood events, but this is a very intensive process. So they turn to climate services such as the National Water Model to help with this process. However, despite the information that the National Water can provide being relevant to resilience planning, a recent study of 11 US city resilience plans found no reference to the National Water Model in these plans. So the objective of this study is twofold. It was to investigate how the National Water Model could be applied to resilience planning, and then to understand how the National Water Center, which oversees the National Water Model, could facilitate this use.
And I'll be going over some of the methodology of our study, including the interview process and our collaborative session. Next slide. So as we mentioned, our case study was one of the Houston-Galveston area in Texas. This community is engaged in resilience planning already, with Resilient Houston being published in 2020 as part of the 100 Resilient Cities program. And more generally, the municipality has a strong capacity for planning. Furthermore, the metropolitan area of Houston has recent experience with major extreme weather events and flooding disasters, notably Hurricane Harvey in 2017. Our case analysis was divided up into 4 different phases, the first of which were conducting interviews to understand the baseline perspectives from community resilience stakeholders. Following that, we conducted interviews with National Water Center staff to understand their baseline perspectives and questions. From there, we went on to facilitate a collaborative session, engaging both community resilience stakeholders and National Water Center staff in co-generating a common understanding and set of recommendations for how the National Water Model can inform future resilience building and planning efforts. Finally, recommendations from that session and our data gathered from interviews were synthesized, checked with interviewees for consistency, and shared via a variety of public fora, including this one. Next slide. So we conducted our interviews between February and March of this year with 19 interviewees total. 7 came from Noaa National Water Center staff, and 12 we broadly call resilience community stakeholders. However, it's not a monolithic group, as they came from a variety of different sectors, including academia, planning agency representatives, and non-NOAA federal agencies. Next slide. Of the 12 resilience community stakeholders, all had experience with planning, 7 had experience running hydrologic models, and 5 were aware of hydrologic models or had used their output, but did not run the models themselves. More specific to the National Water Model, 2 community stakeholders had never heard of the model prior to the project. 6 were aware of the model, but had never used it, and only 4 had experience with the model. Next slide. Early on in developing this project, we decided to take a collaborative approach, which would directly engage a diverse set of stakeholders. This is a screenshot of our collaborative session agenda, which was held back in April. As part of the event, we included an hour for two simultaneous breakout rooms with National Water Center staff and resilience and community stakeholders divided roughly evenly in each to co-generate recommendations for the National Water Model and National Water Center. These recommendations were co-developed between the community and the National Water Center and Noaa staff, as the early community involvement and stakeholder engagement has been shown in the literature to be vital to sustained tool use and impact following the tool's release. Next slide.
So then we'll share the results with you, which were primarily in the form of a set of recommendations. And these recommendations were broken into two categories. The first were recommendations for how the resilient stakeholders could use the National Water Model in their resilience planning. And then the second were recommendations for how the National Water Center could facilitate the use of the National Water Model in this community planning. So the first category was our recommendations for resilient stakeholders. And our most overarching recommendation was that while resilience planning covers much longer timescales, the National Water Model can help decide when to act on parts of resilience plan. So this is referencing the fact that the National Water Model has about a 30-day forecasting ability, but obviously resilience planning covers much longer timescales than just 30 days out. So our interviewees had several hypothetical use cases that they suggested for how the National Water Model could be involved in resilience planning. So these use cases were pre-event decision-making, hindcast data for decision-making as a convening tool, and then for post-event assessment. So pre-event decision-making, it was suggested that the National Water Model could be run prior to an expected event to help decide or determine potentially where the water would be. So then that could help inform maybe where to remove resources from a particular area, and then maybe what other areas they could be moved to. Hindcast data for decision-making is referencing the National Water Model's ability to do a retrospective run. So this is essentially looking at what has occurred in the past to potentially inform what could occur in the future to help inform planning efforts. And then it was suggested it could be used as a convening tool. So you could use the National Water Model and its demonstration ability to convene diverse stakeholders to have conversations about particular planning challenges. And then for post-event assessment, it was suggested you could run the model pre and post-event to help assess how things went or how your planning effectiveness was to then maybe inform future planning efforts. And then the other recommendations for resilient stakeholders were in the categories of awareness, input to the National Water Model, and then community connection to the National Water Center. So for awareness, this is referencing the fact that several of our stakeholders had actually never heard of the National Water Model prior to the study. And anecdotally, they had mentioned that there can be a lot of staff turnover in the planning world. So it was suggested that you could write in references to the National Water Model and how it could be used directly into the resilience plan itself. Therefore, no matter who's on staff or what kind of turnover you have, it would help increase awareness of the model and how to use it. Input to the National Water Model is in reference to one of our key results, which we heard over and over again throughout the course of the study, is that the local community stakeholders want to know local data. They want local specific data to know what's happening in their own backyard to be able to make the most effective planning decisions. But obviously the National Water Model is at the national scale and sometimes does not have that local specificity. So it was suggested that there could be mechanisms to integrate local data into the National Water Model to both leverage this climate service, but then also have that local specificity that communities need. And then finally, community connection to the National Water Center is kind of looking at both a trust and a scale issue. One of the issues was that some of the community members kind of referenced that they may not necessarily trust the National Water Model and its output to make the kind of expensive, potentially life-defining decisions you need to make in resilience planning. And they didn't necessarily know who to turn to if they did have questions. So the question was, should the numerous local communities be going to the singular National Water Center for their questions? And then it was suggested that instead of local communities going directly to the National Water Center, they could in turn go to their regional offices. In this case, it would be the river forecast centers and the weather forecast offices to develop, who both have that regional knowledge and also develop trust with them. So it kind of helps that ratio and that trust process along.
And in terms of recommendations for the National Water Center and Noaa staff, they came in 3 different categories, 2 of which are presented here, and the last one is presented on the next slide. So in terms of awareness, the National Water Center can integrate the National Water Model and tools into curricula for graduate level students and have members of National Water Center and Noaa staff advise graduate theses that utilize the tools. In terms of outreach, the National Water Center can present about the model at conferences and for bridging organizations that support local resilience planning. And the National Water Center can publish these and other efforts online on their website. In terms of accessibility, the National Water Model should be for non-experts and hydrologists alike to be able to access and use the National Water Model and its resulting data and visualizations. The National Water Model, or the National Water Center, can support this by providing case studies or demonstrations of how organizations and communities have used the National Water Model for resilience planning. The National Water Center can also provide seed grants to communities to produce such demonstrations and case studies that utilize the model. And another suggestion was that the National Water Center could create a help desk or a support desk for communities that they can go directly to answer what questions they have and guide them to the best resources available given their questions, even if it's not the National Water Model. Next slide. And the last category was in terms of technical changes that were recommended for the National Water Model, including the creation of probabilistic forecasts and the creation of mechanisms for implementing hypothetical alterations to landscape and infrastructures, and the incorporation of improved forcings and model parameters. Many of these changes have already been in the works as part of the Next Gen framework, the framework that governs future iterations of the national and updates the National Water Model. Next slide.
So we have some conclusions, which are what we see as the key takeaways from our study and also what we see as the next steps. So key takeaways. First, we see this as takeaways both specifically for the National Water Center, but then we also think they're more broadly applicable to really anyone that's seeking to develop a tool that could be applied to resilience planning. So first is awareness. We think one of the key points was that some key resilience stakeholders had not heard of the National Water Model, which is relevant because if somebody doesn't know of something, then they can't use it. So what we see as potentially one of the challenges is that the National Water Model itself is very disciplinary. It is a hydrologic model, but its data and related services are very relevant to resilience planning, which is inherently interdisciplinary. So it's about how it's being advertised. So traditionally, you might only go to your own field. So you might be looking at a hydrology audience, but if you're seeking to engage resilience planners, you might need to think more broadly about bridging organizations and other disciplines that could really help increase the awareness of your either the National Water Model or the tool. The second key takeaway is that the National Water Model should facilitate use by experts and non-experts alike. Not all resilience planners are hydrologists or have expertise in running models, but the data and related services are relevant to them, meaning where water has been in the past, where it is currently, and where it is in the future. Therefore, it should be in a variety of formats that allow them to access it. Additionally, there is a need for locally specific data and visualization products. So whether or not your model can provide that level of customization, potentially allowing some sort of a mechanism for communities to adapt it for their own use, may be a relevant mechanism. And then really optimistically, there are many opportunities for collaboration. Our recommendations show that there are many ways that communities can support the National Water Model. And there's also many ways that the National Water Center can conduct outreach and adopt community input into the National Water Model. And just anecdotally, Josh and I found that everyone that we spoke to is actually very engaged on this topic. So we see that really optimistically, both for future iterations of our own work and then for anyone else who's seeking to engage in this space as well. And then you also might be thinking to yourself, okay, that's great, but I myself am not a tool developer. But we see that this project does have lessons for the rest of us. So we do see the main takeaway being that collaboration and co-development between end users and creators, which we're intentionally using to mean the broadest sense of the word, is essential. So if you're asking yourself, do you create anything meant for use by somebody else? Do you create plans or projects for communities? Do you have a data set that's meant to impact something or for use by a particular group of people? Or do you think that what you're finding in your study might actually be relevant to a different field other than your own? So we think it is important to consider the needs and expectations of end users, meaning that's a very broad category, from the beginning of whatever you're working on. So what we ask is, what could this look like? We think that you could consider development of your project team, budget, timeline, and how you're building in consistent collaboration into whatever it is you might be studying. So for your project team, whether or not you're trying to create a team to create a plan or a project, or you're developing a proposal, who are you including on that team? Maybe you're developing a model and traditionally you have entirely quantitative expertise. Potentially you can include a social scientist or somebody who has more end user engagement expertise. With your budget, whether that's predefined or there's some flexibility, that could be building in a budget for community outreach or end user engagement within that process and potentially supporting their time. For the timeline, maybe that's allocating a certain amount of time for this outreach, which can be a fairly time intensive process, or extending your timeline to allow for more effective engagement. And then with consistent collaboration, and we see this being the most important, as Steve touched on in the beginning, it's traditionally in the past been community outreach has happened at the end of a project. You know, here's a product, hey, what do you think of it? We think that it should definitely happen from the get-go at conceptualization. So there is that chance for customization to the community, but it's also consistency. It's engaging that community in more of a co-development process so that they take some sort of ownership over the project and they're more likely to use it and it will be adapted for their needs. Because at the end of the day, science, products, data, project, whatever it is that you are creating won't achieve its intended impact, especially in the realm of climate change, if people do not know that it exists, cannot access it in the form that it's in, or don't trust it. So collaboration and co-development can really help in all of these areas. So then to get off of the soapbox for a second, what we see as the next steps for this project is, first and foremost, we'd really like to replicate this case study in other regions of the US. We think it's important to understand how community specific these recommendations are, or potentially how generalizable they are. Josh and I would also really like to support the development of the use cases we discussed. We'd like to help communities figure out how they could use the National Water Model in their own planning efforts and then document those to help maybe inspire other communities in their own use. And then we'd also like to integrate these recommendations into National Water Model and National Water Center outreach practice and other Noaa initiatives. We have a little bit of a call to action. Josh and I are actively seeking opportunities to continue this work. So if you know of a community who might like to engage with us in future iterations, we encourage you to reach out to either of us. Our emails are provided here, and then we're also providing them here on this slide. So that's our high level of our project, and we definitely welcome your questions or suggestions for our next iterations now. And thank you again for having us.
Thank you.
Hey, Josh, Christian, thank you very much for the nimble way in which you put that all together. I know you've been doing a few briefings, including to the sponsors and the folks at the National Water Center, and how have they responded to your recommendations?
Honestly, it's been very optimistic. I think they've been very excited about this new application. I mean, that's what one of the main goals of the National Water Model, which we've heard from our collaborators, is trying to provide, information where none has been before. But obviously, that's only useful if it's in a form that's actually going to get to the end user. And we just see that as really optimistic. They very much care about who's using it and how they're using it, and they want it to be accessible to the broadest amount of people possible. So they've actually been very enthusiastic and very eager to work with us to try to continue this project.
Well, that's great. That's the ideal outcome of here. And sorry, Josh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to build on that point. As the Noaa Service Delivery Framework, which is this concept that Noaa has internally about how they're trying to roll out different products and services that they have, including the National Water Model, directly references some of the collaborative engagement that our project seek to fill in. And I think they saw our study as a way to try and help them better actualize and implement this framework in how they are delivering this particular product to the communities they would like it to get to, that there is this collaborative dialogue. And as we mentioned, this collaborative session, the National Water Model wasn't just Noaa staff putting the model together and then, pushing it out to communities. In fact, there were staff in the call and community members in real time having a dialogue around what was and wasn't working, and then co-generating those recommendations. So I think they see that type of collaboration as a source of excitement and enthusiasm, and further fulfilling the mission that they've already set out to accomplish. So creating data where it didn't already exist. Great.
Ed, as somebody who was on the front lines of dealing with all the water that came at you with Hurricane Katrina, first, your comments, reactions to what you've heard here today.
Well, I have a lot of comments and a lot of questions, Kristen and Josh. I have a regret, and that was I didn't know about this sooner. I might could have been very helpful to you. So the first question I have to ask though, who were the resilient stakeholders?
Josh, you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, I don't think we're permitted to name names so much, but what we can say is that there were, non-NOAA federal agencies that were involved, that we got participation from. We had more than one set of academic stakeholders from universities within the state. And we also had, there are multiple different planning agencies that are in the area. And we were able to have some of representatives from those respective agencies participate.
well,
And
let
we
me
did
ask
have
it
all
another
of
way.
those.
Let me ask
You might
it
be able to
another
fill in
way
the
then.
names of some of those, but
Okay. Let me ask it another way, not to put you
Right.
on the spot, but who is in charge of flood control in the Houston area?
I mean, there's several organizations. I don't
No.
know if we can.
Who is in charge? There's only one.
would that be the flood control district?
Yes. Yeah, so I'm assuming you talked to the flood control district?
I'm just not sure how much we're allowed to say about who we talked to in the project being such a small group with IRBM. That's why we're hesitating.
Okay, but and
I think that would be a safe assumption.
okay, and I'm not being argumentative here, but Houston has very little to do with the whole question of flood control. It is a county function, and Harris County Flood Control District. That's why it's important that they have connection to the national water model. I'm not sure it's very important that a lot of these other people do. And obviously I have a very personal background in this since I was responsible during Harvey. And so that I'm not trying to get you to tell things you can't tell, but if you didn't talk to the right stakeholders, then the whole thing is kind of moot. And so I just want to be sure that Harris County flood control was the key component, because if not, if Jeff Lindner, for example, wasn't in the interview process, he is the one that pretty much determines the flood control projections, everything about it. And so that's why I'm asking those questions the way I am, because there was a reference to the city resilience plan.
Yeah, that was
Comes-
as
But
an
when it comes
example.
to flood control, it's really much more the county.
Yeah, so I think that's why we broadened it to we originally were focusing on Houston, but that's why we keep saying Houston, Galveston area, because it's really, I think that's probably all we can allude to is yes, it was more regional, because obviously it's not just the city of Houston that is involved in that region, it is much more broad. So without naming organizations, yes, we were looking at for that reason broader.
Okay, and I guess I wasn't clear on what really the recommendations are. Because Harris County does a lot of this already, and they run models constantly. And I'm relatively sure that Jeff is very familiar with the national water model. And if not, I'm sure the Rice Speed Center is very aware of the national water model. And so I guess the recommendations, by not being able to be too specific, I'm not sure what my takeaway of this is.
Well, maybe I can here. I think one of the objectives here is that while it's clearly, as you say, a single point who's responsible for the flood control for Harris County, there's a lot of people planning, there's developers planning, there's a whole bunch of folks who have plans that in theory should be taken into account. These efforts, and not all that necessarily is well coordinated with the county or with the key players, right? I mean, that's just the reality. There's a lot of stakeholders doing it. And the more of them, presumably, that we're aware of these tools and we're integrating the tools, the better. But is that a fair assumption? Because I think that's part of what it was that, that I think they looked at where there were a lot of people engaged in things we call resilience planning that were supposed to be addressing climate change, but weren't fully familiar, even probably in their own county, what it was available for them.
Well, and I'm not sure that they even refer to climate change one way or the other. What happens on developers, of course, is developers have to get their plans approved, and that plan approval comes from either the county or the city. And in the case of Harris County and the city of Houston, this is way more than you want to know, but unincorporated Harris County is larger than the city of Houston. And that's unique really in the country. And it's because of the way annexation developed. So most of the development is being done in unincorporated Harris County. Houston's actually losing population. And having said that, though, unincorporated Harris County is still within the ETJ of the city of Houston. So it falls under the Houston Planning Commission, but yet the permitting all comes from the county. And the developers, they, depending on their own personal interest, I guess, they may or may not care about any of this, but they certainly have to go through the county permit process. And so that's the key piece where this model needs to be updated. And for example, on Harvey, after Harvey, we greatly increased the level at which you had to raise your slabs in order to develop in unincorporated Harris County. So anyway, I'm not being, don't take any of this wrong. I'm not being negative. I'd love to sit down and spend more time with you. As an inside colleague, if you could share information with me, I might be helpful.
We'll definitely want to take you up on that. I know. Yeah. Christian, Josh, other reactions?
We're definitely looking at the next iterations of this project because yes, this was just a case study. We were looking at a very small group of individuals, and that's actually one of the main things we want to see is, how generalizable was this, or did we miss key stakeholders? That's why we think that, this was just a very small little grant that we got. So we're really hoping to build this out to actually get a more accurate picture of, who is using the model. Is it being used as it should be? Is there ways that the model could change to be more useful to communities? And actually particularly looking at lack of capacity as well. That's actually one of the key areas we'd like to get into investigating. So we definitely take you up on what we're just a few weeks out from having those conversations, but we'd love to include you in this.
Okay, and I'm even willing to come up to Boston because it's hot down here.
Well, there's plenty of space at GRI. I'm sure we could figure something out.
And
Yeah.
visit about that. But just one more point, I guess, in order to get the model used, and I don't know the answer to this, but if a couple of key offices are using the model, then by default, it will be used by everybody that has to go to those offices for permitting. And that's my point in all of this. As long as we have the right people involved, and if they're using the model, then that's great. It doesn't matter if 25 other people are not, because the model is being used, like I said, by default.
Actually, Josh, that could be a good, so we have a proposal out. We don't know if it will be funded, but one of the iterations is actually to develop those case studies with community or, those implemented use cases. So I think that would actually be very interested is maybe to work with you to identify who those key stakeholders might be. So if they have a use case that actually might, anyway, just a thought, Josh, I think that could be very interesting.
Definitely. And I know earlier on you'd mentioned, Ed, one of your questions were that you were a little less clear about what some of the recommendations were that we were proposing. And this dovetails a little bit into the question that I see in the chat from Mark about the current landscape. So the National Water Model is this very national scale tool. It covers so much different area that to have a hyper-local focus to the extent that a very localized model developed by a local team could create that resolution. There's a gap between what a national tool can achieve accurately and successfully and what a local team or a local model supporting a local case can produce. And so that there is a resolution gap there. And as far as infrastructures, something that we see is that in a place like Texas and the Houston Galveston area, where there is a good chunk of impervious land area, that not always does a national tool like the National Water Model as accurately as it could reflect some of those man-made alterations to landscape that could change where water is going to flow. And so having a higher resolution understanding of that and integrating local model data that, you know, as you said, there are some local models that are produced in the area, and we've heard of some of them as well. And that one of the recommendations that came out of our collaborative sessions was, you know, what potential would there be now and into the future for integrating some of the efforts of local planning agencies and local model developers, and integrating that into this national model to improve and enhance what already exists and is publicly available through federal agencies and these models that they're providing, with National Water Model being the example. And as far, Mark, as the first question regarding how quickly does it take for a regional planner or a city to get up to speed on this model, I think there is, unfortunately, it's not a satisfying answer, but there's a range. There are some cities that are totally out of their depth and are unable to, you know, take advantage of this tool, as it's just, they don't have people on staff with the training, and they don't have the time, even if they did, or the resources to fully take advantage of it. And, you know, we did hear through some of our interviewees that were local that yes, they did have some experience with it. They were able to get their, into the use of the model, and that it can take some time. It didn't sound like it was an overnight process, but it did sound like, you know, for those hydrologists that were locally and regionally available, that were part of these planning agencies, that there was some ability to use these tools, yes, but it does presuppose that there are the resources to have them on staff to then use the tool, or decide that in certain cases that maybe they would develop their own, and that would better serve their needs based on the current state of the National Water Model. So I realize I'm kind of jumping back and forth between two sets of questions, but either of you, if there's any responses you'd like to make, please.
Okay, well, appreciate that here, and maybe I can kick it over to Fernando Pavlon, who's one of our partners and based out of Puerto Rico. But what are these that you've heard here from Kristen and Josh, or takeaways from your perspective, or any comments or reactions I have, Fernando?
Hi, Stephen, and hi, Kristen. And I just first want to congratulate both you and Joshua for a great presentation. Very interesting. So my key takeaways are that, first, thank you for throwing light on the clarity that science, products, data won't achieve the intended impact if people do not know that they exist. That's key. And spreading that message is paramount to putting these kinds of tools on an adequate path for implementation. In Puerto Rico, distinct from the states, we don't have the county figure. We have municipalities or the state. So in that sense, we've had for a long time a debate on whether the smallest political jurisdiction should be based on boundaries that were decided a long time ago along perhaps family property lines and that kind of thing, whereas perhaps they should be defined by hydrographic basins or units or groupings of such units. So this research definitely throws light on the fact that it's very relevant for governance also, not just planning, but it has political implications, social implications for communities and how they operate, how they function together. So that for me is the takeaway. Thank you so much. There's definitely so many more questions will come up, but I encourage you to keep going, and I look forward to hopefully in the future working together.
Great. Thank you for that, Fernando. Others who, questions or comments? Mark, as somebody who's, looks like you're underwater, but I know you're, but obviously with our Marine Science Center et al. And water is your thing, is what are some of the key takeaways that you had, or comments or recommendations?
Well, I think during the conclusion section, Kristen and Josh did a great job summing up some of the challenges here, and thanks for the detailed answer, Josh, to my chat. I'm going to be exploring this tool in more detail. I suspect that it was designed, though, since it's a macro scale tool, that it probably stops right where coastal infrastructure that's influenced by tides begins. If it doesn't, it has some utility then for built infrastructure like dams or tide gates that I work on, because a lot of coastal towns in Massachusetts have infrastructure that is effectively a part of a freshwater system where flooding could happen, but it connects right at the edge of the ocean to the coastal zone, and that's where all the sea level rise and storm surge models that Noaa is also developing intersect. So coastal communities have some unique challenges. And by the way, it's nice to see you, Judge Emmett, on screen. Thanks for your involvement in this and through the years with GRI. So I learned a lot, and I'm inspired to learn more about the NWM.
Yeah, and we'd be happy to put you in touch with our collaborators. Honestly, we've been very grateful to work with them. Their enthusiasm throughout this project, we've been very grateful for. And while I can't say specifics because I'm not a hydrologist, we do know that we've spoken to a lot of the Noaa folks who actually are working on coastal coupling. That's part of their next gen framework, exactly for that reason, because obviously coastal communities, it's not just inland flooding, it's also sea level rise and storm surge and all that good stuff. So that is definitely something that they're very aware of, and that there's a whole team. And actually, I'm thinking one person in particular, if that's an issue that you'd like to learn more about the model, we'd be happy to put you in touch.
Yeah, the NSF funded research that just concluded that I was on with GRI affiliate Brian Helmuth, who we've now been folded into the management group for the town of Marshfield on the South Shore that's wrestling with rainy day flooding now, and they've got several tide gates, and they're really worried about not only conserving coastal wetlands, but all the liability issues that they're now up against. And part of those liability issues stem from not the ocean coming in, but from the tide gate not being able to cope with flooding waters during heavy rain events inland that come charging down into Marshfield. So it's a tough problem, and we're trying to advise them whether they need a better sensor network so they have an early warning system. That may be the wave of the future, is that as the cost of getting data in real time goes down and we have more and more Internet of Things, we may get near real time decision support tools that can really save lives and property as things evolve.
Great. And I'll just clarify too for Fernando that actually for much of New England, it's very much like Puerto Rico. We don't have functioning county government. Counties are just for judicial purposes. And so every postage stamp sized community across New England go direct to the governor. It's fairly dysfunctional and makes coordination and collaboration challenging. So, but one of the things that I was able to participate in a briefing that Josh and Christian did to FEMA on this. And one of the things we ended up talking about, because I nudged it along, and I know Judge Emmett, you would probably have some good insights on this, but it's actually an element of course, emergency management itself. And in Harris County, the role that Judge Emmett plays as the lead on Homeland Security emergency management, but is on potentially surgical, what I call surgical evacuation, right? There was a huge issue about whether or not you evacuate the city or not. I think, and I learned enough about the greater Houston area to know that all roads in Houston just go to Houston. Well, they circle around it. They don't actually go north or south very well, or east to west. It's a mega city that basically has roads to support itself. So it's very hard to think about how you take that population and decide you're going to move it north or east or west. So the notion here that with better data, not every place was flooded. And that true in neighborhoods, not every place will be flooded. And is it possible with better data and tools that we could be much more effective in evacuation? Because there's a key resilience issue if we send particularly underserved population, disadvantaged populations out of a city for a long period of time. Many instances, they can't afford to come back. They can't afford to stay away anyways, any period of time. So anything that can be done that makes evacuation less of a mass humanity effort, or nope, we're just not going to do it at all. And can these tools potentially be something that could help with that process? Ed, is that something that you have thought about or have some ideas about?
Well, it is, but it sort of dovetails into a question I wanted to ask Kristen and Josh. I'm certainly not versed in what the national water model is, but does it model surge waters in addition to flow waters? Because people, when they talk about Hurricane Harvey never hit Houston or Harris County. What we got were the tropical storm rains after the hurricane, which made it so different because we're really well prepared to deal with hurricanes. Hurricanes are simple. I never thought I'd find myself saying that, but you calculate where the storm surge is, you do the evacuations based on who's going to be inundated by storm surge. But Harvey, the rains were totally different. They went over the entire area, 50 inches of rain. So does the model calculate both types of water or just the rainfall type?
That's a good question. And that's where Josh and I are like, we're probably going to become very well versed in this model, but currently I know that it's primarily a stream flow model. And I know that they are working to get that coastal coupling in there. I think that at the time of the study, I don't think that was one of its strong suits, was getting that coastal coupling storm surge in there. I can't say that it doesn't, and I feel like anybody watching the recording, we might get emails from Noah after if I'm saying this wrong, but that is one of the things they are working on. They would like to increase its capability, but primarily it is stream flow, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that was my understanding, but to something Mark said, people don't understand what various local communities have done. For example, Associated Press wanted to write a story about 3 cities that were going to be flooded in the future: Miami, New Orleans, and Houston. And it said Houston was sinking because of subsidence. That's not true. Years ago, Houston, Galveston area created a subsidence district, and we haven't pumped groundwater for a long, long time. That has to be part of the model. It doesn't mean we're still subject to flooding. It's just we're not flooding ourselves by subsiding. But if the tides are right and if the storm surge is right, and then that's followed by a rain, that's the model we don't have a good grip on at all. So that's why I asked the question.
I think what I can speak to is that was one of the, again, not being a hydrologist, that was one of the things that was pointed out by some of our more hydrology expert interviewees, was that I think it's what do they call it, like the forcings or whatever. It's basically static physics across the whole US right now. And that was one of the things that they were looking at, is like, can you get more regional specificity? Is there a way for those local, either it's those regional offices, like the forecast centers or the weather forecast offices, or just local communities themselves? Is there a way for them to build in those local specific parameters? Because that's what people are saying, is the general is great for a first glance. It's great for high level, like maybe is this a problem type questions, but like, when you're making those really local specific decisions, those are expensive and those are costly and like can be very life expensive as well. So it's sort of like, but you do need that local specificity. So that was one of the key takeaways, is everybody needs as local specific as they can get. But that's kind of the question, is that up to the national water model to do that for everywhere, for everybody? Or is there some sort of like a hybrid, is there a way to get the local, having a bit more agency? Because there's plenty of people local who do have that expertise, who do have that data, who can put that in. So it's sort of that's one of the questions we'd like to explore more, is that's the scale issue. Is there's so many local communities, there's one national water center, where's that nice mix in the middle where the communities are getting what they need, without having to do it all themselves, and the national water center doesn't have to do it all themselves either. So that is kind of one of the key challenges, and that's not just national water model, that's like pretty much all tool development too.
I think it's a very important issue. I mean, my experience has been that the federal government tends to sponsor models that help the federal government. um, and not necessarily think about how they're actually going to be used or applied in local regional contexts. And that typically doesn't work very well because it is a very big country that's very diverse, and you know, in terms of climate and regions, and but also in terms of even the way governance and jurisdictions work. But you know, their tendency is to grab for these more macro tools that can support national level decision making, and less about how they support localized decision making. But everything we've learned about community resilience is that it's a bottom up effort, that you really have to figure out how we bake this into decisions that are being made, as they're being made at the local level. And to the degree that tools are not relevant to them, or you know, don't take into account the complexity often of being in like an environment which interacts between fresh and salt water, or as the Harvey example that Judge Emmett was just laying out illustrates, that it's not so much storm surge, but deluge and you know, runoff, and take into account whether there's subsistence or not. All these variables here are key if a tool is going to be seen as useful or valuable. And that's why I think a core finding that you had, and one that you take away and it animates our work, of that, this collaborative approach. You know, we call it at the Global Resilience Institute that every time we engage, it's about co-learning. We have some expertise, but we're never expert on a local community. We're never expert on their needs. We're not an expert on, you know, what makes them a community. That's something we have to learn. We can share some of the expertise that we've garnered from the academy or from other case studies or practice we've been involved with here, but it's going to be an exchange. And that's something that academia doesn't do very well, typically, as well as the federal government. But it's something we have to get better at if we're going to be actually able to bring about change. The other point I'd make, you know, overall, which animates our work here, is, you know, we don't have a lot of time to figure out how we deploy these models and so forth. I mean, this is something, you know, it's happening in real time with a great deal of urgency, or should be treated as if it has a great deal of urgency. You know, traditionally, we have learned and refined tools and models, and it's taken us often, you know, decades to evolve from knowledge to common practice. We are not going to confront the speed at which the climate is changing and its impacts are, you know, by traditional models of academia sticking in its lane, government sticking in its lanes, private sector sitting in its lanes, and so forth. It's going to be a much more interactive environment. So having practitioners involved with academia, kind of, I know Judge Emmett does with our institute, but very importantly does with Rice University. That's the kind of model that we have to have going forward. And postdocs like Josh and Christian, who are out there, you know, testing their ideas in the lab of the real world, and getting feedback and refining as they bring leadership to these issues going forward. So we really appreciate the insights that you shared with us today, and I want to leave you time for some closing thoughts or comments. Christian, want to get us started with that?
Sure. First, just thank you for the engagement today. We love sharing the work like this, just for the ideas that come out of it and the new connections we can make. We think this is just kind of a very new grain of a research project that could really blossom into, I don't know, quite a few different areas of research. So we want to stress again, if you have thoughts, if you have questions, if you have ideas or communities you think might be interested in engaging in this kind of work, please reach out to us. Or if you would like to know more about the National Water Model, like Mark will be sure to connect you with my collaborator. We love to be connectors, so we very sincerely just want to make sure that science actually does something and does what it's intending to do. So if you have thoughts, ideas, or connections, we'd love to be of service.
Great, Josh.
Sure. I also just want to echo what Kristen said. So again, thank you all for coming and for listening and hearing about some of the insights that we gleaned through our work, but that there is this broader call to action, that we see a gap between what you know, this tool specifically in our work, but that more broadly, that there is an urgency to you know, climate change and to advancing resilience, that there, you know, the less we delay and the more that we're able to optimize the tools that are already under development or exist now to support communities, however we can bridge that gap as quickly as we can. And effectively, we want to do that and support communities where they are, and to increase the trust between different organizations, and because in the absence of trust, it is much harder to build the type of community resilience that would best position communities in the face of the challenges that remain ahead of us. I do see a hand up, Iglau.
Yes, yeah, please, Iglau. Iglau, I get I see your hand up. Do you have a question or comment? And you're on mute if you do.
Hello, how are you?
We're doing good.
Oh, I am Ijlal. I am a Humphrey Fellow, 2018, 2019, MIT. And the topic is very interesting to me. As you know, we have in Khartoum, we have Tuti Island is in the confluence of the Blue and White Nile, and it is usually subjected to flooding during the rainy season. It's very interesting how people come together, the collaboration between all the traditional settlers in combating the adverse effects of the flood. So I would like some time maybe to share with you how people, they come together to combat these adverse effects. And they have really traditional means in inspiring the people to come and to put the sacks of the sand, and they know when the flood is coming. They have their own means to know that the flood is approaching. It is coming by the color of the water, they say sometimes, by the voice they hear from the water, and such things. So this is just what I want to share with you, and thank you so much.
Very good. I think that's so important, that again, that local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, knowledge that may have been passed down from generation to generation, which can be more effective than some of the best tools we create out of from the world of science. So thanks so much for sharing that, and look forward to the learning from that experience. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, with that, then I am gonna turn over. Angie, is there anything that we need to announce going forward in terms of next events or upcoming stuff, or shall I bring this to closure?
I think you can bring it to closure. We are planning for our next event, but we will go ahead and send an email out for July in the next week.
Okay, with that, then I'm going to wish everybody a wonderful, for those who are here on the stateside, a 4th of July holiday weekend coming up. And really, again, appreciate Christian and Josh putting together the presentation, and all of you for